Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's a great end.
Well, I like to be sporty.
I love it. I noticed that the other day on the plane.
I love you.
Right?
I need you.
We're by night. That's our. Normally we're at meetings with all community principals and myself.
Do we have more?
I like it when it's like New York City has all the.
Oh, yeah.
Acronyms.
Right, like so.
Yeah.
We're one of the few that actually has like a capital letter. Most of the others are.
Only good thing.
Most
So,
are.
that.
Oh, you watch that.
We're the one with the.
Yes.
Definitely gonna be a full.
Great game. Are you watching the job? Watching the highlights from last night.
I was surprised for a bunch of young kids, that was about ready.
No kidding. Something in maybe 20 days.
We're all interested to see how that's a very good relationship.
We're gonna get started.
We have folks filtering in.
Okay, if it gets loud, I will do the door shut.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that.
One such start like you, yes.
That's why I'm looking for it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to this follow-up meeting. Some of you we've met with this summer, and a lot of you we've interfaced with on sites, together feedback, and I see some new faces too. So thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon. I just want to say we're the planning team that's running the Homeless Resource Center text amendment. Nick Norris is our planning director. If you don't already know Nick, I'm Michaela Otai as deputy. This is Kelsey Lindquist, our planning manager, and Liz Hart, principal planner. And we've been working tirelessly on this project. We work on land use and planning, and we've been working to come up with, as you know, an improved process for the siting of homeless resource centers for homeless shelters in Salt Lake City. We know that we're not gonna fix our societal ills in God knows how long. We know that we have to plan for homeless resource centers, and we're hoping that this process is an improvement from what we had on the books. Today, we're going to review the feedback from all the groups that we've met with. It might be a bit of a recap for some of you, but we want to talk about how we took in all that feedback and used it. We're going to go over all the considerations that we took in to write this text amendment, what our analysis was. We're going to present our proposal to you so that you can ask us questions about it. We're going to talk about next steps. I know that there's been a month or so where we have been working on this process. You know, at the end of January, we have to transmit something to council, but there are going to be, today is just one next step, but there are going to be several steps where you can engage with us, give us feedback, take this in, take this back to your other stakeholders, and we can keep this whole engagement process going. Next slide, please. Just a recap, in 2022, Salt Lake City Council adopted a moratorium, and they gave us these goals, right? Like, we need an improved process for siting homeless resource centers, and we need to consider these things: safety and welfare of those experiencing homelessness, the impact to communities when HRCs and services are concentrated near each other, taken in, the impact on city services needs to be part of this process, some consideration of that, the financial ability of these operators basically to comply, like we cannot put code in that's way too onerous so that we'll never be able to have another HRC again. And addressing equity of site use throughout the city. We're in the highlighted section here in October, July, August, we met with many of you. September, you did some work in-house to come up with our proposal. Today's our follow-up. We have started our 45-day public engagement. But during November and December, all the way through city council public hearings, this is our engagement period, and we are going to have a Facebook Live on November 1st. We're going to have an open house on the 7th. Please come, spread the word. And we have the Planning Commission public hearing slated for December 14th. A transmittal deadline of January 31st. So council wants this by January 31st because they have to pass something. Otherwise, it will respect the process.
Are we talking about regular homeless shelters and temporary homes?
Yes. Thank you.
All right, so as Michaela mentioned, my name is Kelsey. I'm a planning manager with the planning division. This section of the presentation will provide an overview of what we heard during the focus group meetings, which were held in the summer months. So planning staff engaged with several key stakeholder groups. These groups included advocates, community organization representatives, service providers, business owners, unsheltered individuals, as well as operators. The goal of engaging with these stakeholders was to understand the breadth of the concerns and impacts that the community faces, as well as how to improve regulations for the individuals utilizing the homeless resource centers and those services. It was really vital to understand the scope of concerns from all engaged stakeholders so that staff can address as many of those concerns as possible. This may become repetitive, and you'll hear this a few times throughout this presentation. Zoning regulations cannot address every concern or impact that was provided during those engagement sessions. Additionally, staff presented some options for the amendment going forward to these stakeholder groups, and feedback was provided on the options that help draft the ordinance.
Are we able to ask questions during this, or we wait to the end?
It might be best to wait to the end so that we can get through it.
Kelsey, will you share it with us, or is
It's
this
being recorded.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks.
So after the stakeholder engagement series, planning organized the comments into 5 main topics. These topics include location, enforcement, safety, operations, and process needs. We heard in regards of location that any new homeless resource center should really be integrated into a community. That there should be equity when considering the location. And equity really includes the proximity to existing homeless resource centers, similar uses, or uses that are considered impactful. With that said, we do understand that land costs and size reality when considering a new location can be difficult. Many of the comments and concerns included enforcement of requirements for homeless resource centers. Comments seem to indicate that there isn't adequate follow-up on whether the requirements are functioning as promised. And that there was acknowledgement that service providers can't be expected to enforce regulations on public or other private property outside of a homeless resource center. Additionally, we heard concerns about a camp abatement and impacts from homeless resource centers, and we were requested to provide clarity on who is responsible within the city to provide these enforcement services. In terms of safety, we heard that there are safety concerns and considerations to the broader community and neighborhood where the HRCs are cited, as well as for the HRC clients. We heard that there are safety impacts to surrounding neighborhoods, and additionally, there are impacts to emergency response times. We also heard that there might be additional need for quiet rooms or private spaces in some of these homeless resource centers. to provide, the emergency response teams with adequate space. Next slide. We heard, from service providers that it is challenging to comply with unfunded regulations, and that establishing a best practice is difficult to achieve without adequate funding and resources. We heard that there is a need for additional related services such as cooling rooms in the summertime. Next slide. We also received vital feedback on what we needed to consider as far as amending the city regulations. We were directed to conduct a mapping analysis, which Liz will go over in a few slides. The cost of complying with the regulations, city service and city budget impacts, as well as a dive into what other cities are currently doing. As a continuation of the listening service series, staff met with other city departments to understand their impacts and other considerations. This was conducted prior to the small group engagements. This is going to be a little repetitive for those of you that attended the engagement series, but I will try to go through these as quickly. So these really established a common ground discussion with all city departments and divisions so we could understand all of the impacts. We also wanted to ensure that we heard from the impacted departments so that we could align those comments with the comments that we received from stakeholders. So as far as first responder, the police and fire indicated that there is a strain on capacity and on response times. Priority areas also continue to shift with new location of encampments, and if a new homeless resource center is sited in the city, that priority area would shift as well. Public services provided comments related primarily to parking and snow removal. This is because a siting of a new homeless resource center would require shifting priority access roads to that homeless resource center. Next slide. Civil enforcement indicated that there's an impact to their staffing. This is due to an uptick in inspections of vacant and boarded buildings, primarily near and within the proximity of existing homeless resource centers. That does put a strain on their staff and their resources. Next slide. Parks indicated that there's an increase in negative activity in several public parks. This increases the demand for cleaning and facility repairs. There's also been damage to historic objects, specifically in Liberty Park. And there's an increase in mental health emergencies. Economic development is focused on the small business concerns, and they do receive a number of complaints regarding impacts to those small businesses. At this time, I'm going to turn the time over to Liz to go over the analysis.
So staff, excuse me, so staff did a few things to conduct our analysis. We toured 2 HRCs, and as Kelsey just went over with you, we took all the comments we got from the focus group and city departments and categorized them, and then looked at those comments and identified.
Yeah, can you speak up a bit, please?
So we took those comments and we categorized them, and then what we did is we looked at them and identified which comments still we could actually address. Then we looked at our existing code. We identified gaps in the code from what we heard from the focus groups and also what we saw at the HRCs that we toured. As Kelsey mentioned, we did do a map analysis. We did this map analysis with the goal to understand the breadth and complexity of the needs of the unsheltered community and the city service impacts. To do this, we analyzed existing conditions associated with current locations of the HRCs and evaluated acceptable locations for future centers. Now, the map on the screen is just one map we created. We created multiple maps. And the things that we looked at were fire districts, the location of the fire stations in proximity to HRCs, land values, opportunity areas, existing recurring encampments, transit locations, HRC locations, food pantries, grocery and liquor store locations, and vacant and boarded buildings. So the map that's on the screen right now, this map shows HRC locations in relation to HRC resources. So the yellow stars are the existing HRC locations. The red dots are fire stations, the purple dots are track stations, and the blue dots are different HRC sources that we identified as staff, and we also did receive a list from someone at one of the HRCs that we also put on this map. So from these maps, we were able to conclude that in order to support a new HRC location in the city, that being zone specific would not be equitable. And that by identifying standards that would impact that the location would have on HRCs itself and the city was the best way to move forward when considering a site or a new site for an HRC. So this led us to our proposal, which Nick is going to go over here.
Who gets to control the presentation? Okay, just go ahead and start going to the next slide. So as Liz said, our analysis led us to this concept of what's called an overlay zone. And so in very brief terms, an overlay zone is a type of zoning regulation that sits on top of a base zone. The reason why we landed on this was because based on all of the things that you've just heard, there's not a process within the zoning ordinance that can adequately respond to all of those issues. For example, the prior process was the conditional use process, which many of you are familiar with. One of the issues with that is that we know that our current HRCs and future HRCs will have some sort of budget impact on the city. That's not one of the things that the planning commission who decides conditional uses really is in tune with, and it's outside of their role. And so as we were looking at that, we landed on this overlay. So this image on the screen helps describe what an overlay is. And to sum it up, basically, any future HRC would have to go through a zoning map amendment process to apply that overlay to the proposed location. That process is up on the screen on the right-hand side. It's for those that are regularly involved in land use decisions and applications. You probably know what a zoning map amendment is, but it requires a 45-day public engagement period at a minimum. And then a public hearing with the planning commission who makes a recommendation to the city council. The city council also holds a public hearing, and there's an engagement period there as well, a notification period. So it is, the zoning process is the process in the city that provides the most opportunity for public input. Versus the conditional use process, which still has that same 45-day engagement period, but then the decision is made at the planning commission level after a public hearing. So it too is intended to engage the community, but also it's limited in that time frame and opportunity. And the other piece about it is that if you're lucky enough and fortunate enough to be able to attend either a public engagement activity or the planning commission meeting, which are in the evenings, you have more access to that ability to participate than if you don't. If you have to work during those times or have other obligations that are necessary for you and important, the more opportunities we provide, the more access we're providing to people to be engaged in that process. So what's changing? Like I said, this would require a zoning map amendment. And as part of this, we are also to address those needs of those questions about whether the current regulations are working. We are updating, proposing an update to some of the standards that help clarify those existing regulations. And we're adding a few new regulations to help address some things that are currently missing from the standards that we felt were important. It's important to reiterate that homeless resource center, or anyone who operates, definitely not blind to me. Or a homeless shelter is not responsible for people who are not actually using their facilities, right? But we recognize that they do tend to be an attractive use for some people. And so that there are some ancillary things that happen because of that location. But zoning is not going to be able to address that. That's one of the reasons why we feel like the city council is the best entity to make the final decision on where our future HRC should be located. Because they are the ones who have the most access to that information necessary, and also they control the budget for the city. There are specific factors being added to our code to consider. Right now, we have a limited number of things that are intended to be considered for any proposed zoning map amendment. We are adding some that are very specific to this use. So they are things that consider the impact to our police department, ability to respond, the ability for our fire department to also respond. And I know we're doing a number of things within the fire department right now to help with that. But one of the things that I think shocked us a little bit as we were going through this process is that 7% of all of the calls of the fire department go to the 2 HRCs.
To what?
Go to the 2 homeless resource centers. 7% of all calls. Well, most of those are medical related. So, yeah.
Sorry, is it also true then, though, that the CUP for those 2 centers is the only business of any sort in the city that is required to call emergency services at every turn?
That they're required to call? Probably.
That's okay.
There might be some other like treatment facilities and things like that are also required to notify, but they obviously are the one that is probably the most dependent on that.
Nick? Since we have Dennis here, what is the medical issues that are specifically called for? When
I don't know that it's, well, one, I think that that's probably protected information, and I don't think the fire department's gonna tell us what that is. So
You've got 200 clients that are living on the streets generally, have health issues and don't have, proper medical coverage, so. A lot of things got for that, quality honest.
The other thing that we are doing is combining the definitions. Right now, we have a definition for homeless shelter and homeless resource center, and that gets confused sometimes. So we're just combining them into one, just so everyone knows what we're referring to. These are the additional factors that the planning commission and city council would consider for applying the overlay. I'm not going to read all these again. These are all provided the information to everybody, and this is being recorded, so it's available for anyone to view. We'll post a link to this recording. But the big thing here, like I said, are the resources necessary to ensure that the people who need the services provided by Homeless Resource Center are safe, number one, and that our teams that do that can do it. And so there's also some issues like the proximity and access to supportive services, and if they're not proximate, how are people going to get to those services? Because those services are critical for people who need those. And we know that if we just locate an HRC away from all those services, it's going to be problematic. And so we want that to be a factor. And some of the other things on here, like I said, I'm not going to read them all. Hopefully you can all read that and go through it.
Nick, sorry. As far as factors go, since having the services in proximity of where the HRCs are or plan to be, is there a factor that they would open up other services, perhaps in new locations,
And
so that it's not all in one
that could be
location?
one of the potential solutions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you want us to hold our
I
questions?
do,
or do
actually.
you want to, like,
Sorry,
just a lot?
I'm sure people do. The other thing that we've been asked to do is address the temporary and seasonal homeless shelters. So many of you know that this past legislative session, the Utah legislature passed a law that basically, and I'm gonna try to sum this up as straightforward and simply as I can, leaving out a lot of important details, but basically it requires all of the cities in the county to get together and come up with a plan for where these will be. And what the law says is that unless a city waives a certain requirement, that no city will have to host one more than once. Host one winter, they don't need to host one for the next 3 consecutive winters. So once every 4 years, basically. And then there's also some proximity requirements in there that temporary resource center in the state code can't be within a mile of a permanent homeless shelter, within 1,000 feet of a zoning district that allows a residential use, and then within 1,000 feet of certain what is called community locations in the city. Well, we mapped all those in Salt Lake, and it basically prohibits the temporary resource center in Salt Lake City. And so the state law does allow a local government to waive those buffer requirements. We are proposing that Salt Lake City waive some of those within our code, so that we're not having to ask our elected officials every single one of them or not. We think, one, because we allow housing in almost every zoning district in the city, most of the city is eliminated right off the bat from that. And so that is one of those things that we're waiving. We at least in the code is not going to waive the 1 mile proximity to an existing HRC. We're keeping that in there. That's something that we think that the elected officials can choose to waive or not when presented with an option. And then we aren't specifically waiving the community locations, but we're putting in a process that says that that can be done by the head of the community neighborhoods department. So that there's a more streamlined process for that. So those community locations is a pretty extensive list. It's the same list that exists in the state code for locating a business that sells tobacco products. So it's even more restrictive than the alcohol list, the spacing. So some of those things are, they may be appropriate in some neighborhoods of the city, but they may not be appropriate in others. So we wanted to make sure that we had some flexibility with that. One of the big questions is what happens to existing HRCs and homeless shelters? They're allowed to operate under their approval that existed at the time, right? They are not subject necessarily to a change in zoning regulations. If there are some standards that deal with operations that might impact them, that's something that we will definitely factor in as we go through this to figure out what those are.
So they're grandfathered.
They are, basically, just like any other land use, right? They can choose, if they want to apply the overlay, if they feel like they need to expand, if they need to do something else, or a change for whatever reason, they can ask the city to do that. They can go through that process. I wouldn't anticipate that they would do that because they have certain non-compliant rights to do some of those things already. And that's fine. One thing that they would be subject to the change is we have reporting, like an annual reporting requirement for HRCs right now. Some of those requirements are changing. That would be an example of what they would be required to follow. So we'll make sure that we're definitely communicating with that, because one of the things we heard is that is a piece of the current regulations where there's a gap that either the city doesn't know or certain providers aren't aware of certain things that they have to do. And so as we update this code, we also want to make sure that we're improving our communications with those entities so that we're all on the same page. We all know what's going on. And the community does too. Our plan is when we get those reports, provided there's no sort of private information there, is to make those things public. Right? We want to post those and make them available to anyone specific. Next steps. We already talked a little bit about this, but we wanted to reiterate it. We have a couple of public engagement opportunities coming up. November 1st, we're gonna do a Facebook Live event. That too will be recorded and posted on that project website that we mailed out to everybody. And we will continue to send updates to our email listserv. So anyone who's on that will get those updates. If you're not on that, let us know and we'll show you how to sign up for it. Because there's a lot of important things that we're working on right now in the city related to housing and particularly this part of our housing needs in the city. Yeah, and so that's, I think, a great way to stay informed, and you can choose what you participate in, what you're not interested in. We also will be holding another in-person open house sometime the week of November 7th. We're trying to actually still nail down the location.
Working hard.
Time. But we want to do a centrally located place that's easily accessible to people and where people feel safe. So we're trying to figure that out. We know that this building is not a good open house building. We know that the main library can be really challenging for people to find where you are. So we're trying to find something that's more conducive to that. And then we're also going to have a briefing with the Planning Commission on November 9th, where we will go over in detail the proposal. That meeting will be, obviously, all of our Planning Commission meetings are televised on Channel 17 and on YouTube Live. We will record that and actually post it directly into that specific topic so that anyone who wants to find out more can find out more about it too. Because of our compressed time, and we love going out to our community councils and discussing zoning changes and things like that. It's going to, given the time of year and where we are, it's really challenging to get to everyone, and a number of them don't meet in November and December, and so we're trying to do everything we can to make as many opportunities as possible for people to participate. The Planning Commission is going to hold a public hearing on December 14th. Given our deadline imposed by the City Council, we are hoping that they make a recommendation at that meeting, but the one reason why we're doing it on December 14th and not in January is if they want some changes and we have to come back with them, that gives us some time to do that. So there's 2 meetings every month except for in December this year. And so that leaves us a limited opportunity in January to respond to any kind of change that the Planning Commission may want, or that they may want in response to some of the feedback they receive. And so hopefully we can get that deadline and get moving. And then again, we have to have something in the council office by January 1st. So that is our drop dead date. Some people are asking what happens if, and then the council has until, they gave themselves a deadline of May 3rd until May 3rd of next year to adopt changes. If they don't adopt changes by that period of time, there's already a built-in process into that moratorium that they adopted that reinstates that conditional use process in the same zones where it was allowed. So we basically go back to the old.
So is there a map now that we can see?
So there's not a, because of how an overlay works, there is not a map of where these will be allowed. That will be decided on a case-by-case basis.
But there are some industrial zones that aren't.
There are, that's a great
Manufacturing,
point.
right?
Yes, so the M1 and M2 zones are specifically excluded from applying the overlay. The reason for that is because they are so far removed from services that it's unrealistic to think that anyone who may need to use a resource center that might be located in that area are going to be able to access the services that they really need. And so that is a challenge. The transportation options to get people to come from those areas are very challenging. And so that's why we put that provision.
And the reality that manufacturing zones are not hospitable to living conditions, so.
Makes sense.
This is question time now.
Yeah.
It is question time now. Let's try to, I don't know how we want to go.
I just have one quick question and one more, but does the zoning approval process happen before the property is purchased?
Normally what happens is that an entity will put a property under contract with a provision that they get approval and then before they'll close.
And just a methodology question, a qualitative part of the research, which is, what was the criteria for selecting businesses around each of the homeless resource centers, and how many did you actually interview or were part of the focus groups?
Katie and Weston came up with the list, and I think it was provided from economic development. And so if you were in contact with economic development the last couple of years, you would have been provided. But that would be a question for Roberta as far as how those businesses were selected. We had a number of attendees attend those. And then economic development was, we engaged with the deputy director and some of the staff in economic development to just get an overview as well as what they heard.
And we attended the business advisory board.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last comment.
Oh, we attended the business advisory board.
The which?
Business advisory board. Sorry, this is. I'm embarrassed. Our license is atrocious. Thank you.
You mentioned that there's gonna be a separate process for there's gonna be a separate process for temporary overflow shelters. Can we talk about that timeline? And let me explain my
Sure.
concern. As providers, there's been a sudden revelation that we have somewhere between 25 and more than that families with small children living on the streets right now. And so now it's a crisis in the services world. But we have completely discarded anything that needs to go through a planning and zoning process because it will take too long. So in the case of temporary overflow shelters, is there an option? And I understand that there's a very real need to do public engagement. Is there an option to reduce that time frame down so that we have the opportunity to respond to emergencies in our communities?
Yes, there is. So one thing that we are not precluding the city from doing is the city council always has the right to do those temporary land use regulations. All they really need from a process is a 24-hour public notice to do that. Obviously, there's stuff that goes into that before.
Sure, I'm not, the public process is also very important, nobody's trying to undermine that, but in the case of emergencies like this,
Yeah.
where it's gonna be 30 degrees and we have infants living on the streets, we have to be able to do something.
The other thing that I think is an important aspect of this proposal is that, so under federal law, religious institutions we have to treat religious institutions just like we do any other use. They have a protected right to assemble. And the Justice Department of the United States has released all kinds of guidance for local governments related to the ancillary services that religious institutions provide, including sheltering for homeless. And so one thing that we have chosen to do is propose in this that religious institutions are permitted to house and provide shelter for homeless individuals under their constitutional rights to assemble without having to go through these processes.
I've been talking to Jim Walshell about taking a limited section campground in the Northeast. So that is an option, a section we're exploring. I'm wondering if the city has ever looked into the bill changes for Santa Cruz. They actually allow a certain number of cars to have business institutions, religious institutions on driveways, tents to put up in backyards. There's a wall. I'm wondering if that could be an option for us, and then allow businesses, churches, and individuals to kind of take some of the brunt and spread out the population.
Yeah, for this project, we have not expanded the scope because we were yeah.
It's not even.
77 have asked for help and then some dropped out every hour, so we don't know where they all are. It's shocking, and it's a huge, I think the number was 300 children in this matter, so.
And it's gonna snow Saturday. Yeah. So we need a solution now, and we need brave solutions, so. see much of the plan.
Um,
Around the city.
You know, we're happy to, if you want, we will look into that. You said Santa Cruz.
Santa Cruz, yeah, and county report that.
If you can forward that to us, that'll save us a lot of time. And we're happy to take a look at that and see if there's things that fit within what you are asked. We're asked to do, and if not, we can at least give those other options to the city's decision makers. So they can figure out if that's.
So, question for you. Sounds like you're in the, that service. My understanding is that if there's a child in that situation and they are taken into a shelter, that the shelter can now connect with foster care families to.
You don't want to split up, these are children with parents. You don't want to send, you don't want to split up.
I guess my question is, that's an option.
But it's not an acceptable children taken away from homeless families just because they don't have housing. And that's, you know, a child is better than another. Yes, I would say.
It's not considered an acceptable.
I'm not saying that this should be the option. My question is my understanding is that that's an option that they have in place. It's not acceptable, but it's an option that they have in place, correct?
They can't punish homeless families by taking their children away, when all they need is.
When I'm thinking of like the foster care as more of a temporary solution to, in trying not to put the kids into a foster situation.
It's not.
Can we potentially, with all compassion, can we differentiate the emergency need of these 75 families around the streets right now, which is a critical emergency need, fully granted, but that's really beyond the purview of our meeting today.
I just want to make sure that the
Wait.
process addresses those sorts of situations and things.
Right, so I mean, so I think we do need to make that point, and that's a critical point, I think, Mr. Norris made. But I think that needs to not consume our meeting when our purpose is long-term planning for our homeless centers.
One thing that I will say along those lines is, one of the things that we have been consistent about is those things that we have heard during this entire process that are outside of really our area of expertise or what we do, is that we are sharing that with those people in the city whose duties and jobs more relate to that. An example of that, we brought up the board of buildings thing. We're actually communicating very closely with our enforcement to see what we can do to improve that process and help them with that. So we'll do something similar with anything else that comes up.
I've got a quick, maybe semi-hypothetical question. Would this overlay apply to a permanent encampment, which could be on the horizon, or something like the other side of Academy Village? How do those types of options work within that definition of homeless resources?
So a homeless resource center has a fairly narrow definition, right? Those other things would, I suppose that an encampment, if it fit that definition, could petition to apply that overlay. We'd have to look at the details of that, obviously, to see if they actually meet the definition of that. They're not that used and they're not eligible. Things like what TOS is doing with the tiny home village, that is not intended to be the emergency overnight type of shelter type of development. So it's a different type of use.
That's housing.
What's that?
That's housing.
Yeah, it's basically housing, so it's a different thing. I think you're right, that person.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so quick question about the map that you put up. We have, the blue dots. And I was questioning, one, are public schools considered services in your dotting or your mapping? And are we able to actually identify what those blue dots mean on that map? Is the public or our community council people? The blue dots are sort of out there in space
I
and
think we can probably provide that list, everything on there is known, and I don't
That would
think
be
there's
great.
any sensitive uses that would somehow be.
that would be fantastic.
But we'll look at that list and see if we can provide some more background data.
Okay. Oh,
We'll come back.
So you mentioned the fire calls, but they're
we didn't talk about the police calls. The highest calls to police are from HRCs in this city. What is your model? How is your model going to be better or new and improved to cut down on those kinds of police activity? Not only for people who live in the neighborhood or are impacted, but for, you know, these vulnerable people who are inside these facilities who need to be protected as well. So why is your model maybe going to have safeguards that some of the current ones just seem to lack?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's also a very complicated answer, because the way that the police department organizes their response and the fire department organizes their response are two very different things. And so that's something that when we were talking to the police department, what they indicated is they want to be able to know how it impacts their overall ability to respond to a broader district. Their response areas are much larger than the fire departments. And whether or not they end up using and have the resources for the various social workers to respond to some calls versus the true crime and how they prioritize things. Their biggest concern is if they get an increase in their highest priority types of crimes, right? They're not able to respond to them. That's their primary concern. They recognize that whatever we do with a future homeless resource center doesn't necessarily impact that as much as other factors. So that's what they responded to.
Did you answer?
I don't know if I did.
So my
But
question was, is your model, do you feel because of the experience that cities have with HRCs, and now you're entering into this new, you know, plan in this new era, do you see that this new plan will have more safeguards? That we won't see all of these calls going out to HRCs and neighbors, you know, and crime in neighborhoods, you know, developing?
It gives the city council more ability to analyze and research that data to see if there are certain requirements that they can put on future HRC to address those types of things.
Okay.
We can't do that at the planning commission at all, but the city council has broad discretion in making decisions. And so that's one of the reasons why we want that kind of information available for the decision makers to be able to decide if they need to do more or what that impact of the city budget is.
Even closing something down if they're just not responding and.
Potentially. So one of the things, this is getting really into the weeds of this, but one of the things that we've put in that zoning amendment chapter of our code is something that addresses what's commonly known as development agreements.
Right.
And so we did that so that the council has some discretion that basically they're entering into a contract. And if someone violates that contract, the city has more enforcement team than we do normally get the particular zoning enforcement process.
And if I could just jump in and add, and I tried to hit it subtly on the head, but it's not within our purview to direct the HRCs to manage crime off of their property or to manage anything really off of their property. We toured the existing HRCs, they're secure, they're safe facilities. I think overall we were pretty impressed by their operation. You're doing incredible work. And so I think with that acknowledgement, we understand that there are impacts associated with locating HRC, right? Outside of the control of that facility. This process allows the city council to address budget impacts, knowing that maybe there will be an uptick in additional inspections and vacant and boarding buildings. We can't do something with that boarding buildings. We might need another full-time employee, civil enforcement. Okay, there's an impact maybe on loitering or debris or public services.
Drug use, prostitution.
Yeah. I mean, those could be the realities.
But so the responsibility to follow on your statement, then that falls to the police. So it's not the cities will pull back and I won't say not worry about what's happening in the neighborhood, but that would be somebody else's purview, or is it the police, it's a police and neighborhood matter, and it's the city kind of pulls back and.
Well, I mean, the police is part of the city, right?
Right, right.
We have to rely on our police department to enforce.
Yeah.
crime, Right, we have to respond to that, but we don't have, there aren't necessarily other issues, especially for some of those more serious crimes. But there are things that the police department's doing to try to change how they respond to certain things. But ultimately, that will be something that does continue to be the primary source of response.
What about the enforcement department? I mean, we're looking for funding to bolster the enforcement
And
department.
and that could be, like a perfect example for some of these portability
Right.
issues, right? Like when the police department has to, or the fire department has to respond to calls at those places, it has a trickle effect, right?
Yeah.
And so those are the types of things that we're trying to look at, is there are better ways that we can address some of those other things that aren't related to this proposal, but are directly related, but are indirectly related to this. And so that's why we're trying to keep this focused, but also separately deal with some of these other potential improvements.
So kind of just to highlight what Jen was saying though, just to follow up on the question. If we're looking to enforcement and other city entities to make the spaces around HRCs safe, and make them fit into neighborhoods, which I think we are, then when we're looking to our constituents for public input and they ask us questions, obvious enforcement questions, and we basically just say, oh yeah, the city has a plan for that, right? It puts us kind of in an awkward position.
Do you
So-
feel like that's how we're responding to that question?
No, I'm talking about us, at the neighborhood level, we can say, oh yeah, the city has a plan for that, because a lot of times we're not 100% sure what the bolstering of the enforcement, is going to happen, or what's happening at the other city. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's just a gap in our
So-
knowledge and ability to speak to our
So if there are ways that we can improve access to that kind of information,
Yes.
let's do what we can do to help that, okay?
It's gonna be a hot button issue.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In any neighborhood you go into, they're
absolutely.
gonna say, but wait a minute, look at what the track record is that what we're gonna see? So I'm PR, I would ask the city to do some PR and work on that.
As far as PR, I would love to work with you guys on this. We did illegally house some people in the Rose Park neighborhood last year in my garage.
Who is we?
In the garage. My name is Christina, I'm the executive director of Nova Lights.
Oh, hi.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
You missed the handshake.
I want to say that, we did it illegally, we did it hush hush, primarily as a fact-finding mission. How do we bring people together in these neighborhoods and make sure that the neighborhood is safe and everyone wins? At the height, it was only 6 people, but it was 2 vets, a mother and her 7-year-old little girl, and Megan Rowe, who you may know recently was killed by the police. And she was housed there for 6 months. She kept a job for the entire 6 months. On the 3rd month, she said, I don't really like how that makes me feel, and she put that. So it's really powerful. I did go back and interview the neighborhood around afterwards. They're like, oh, did you know there was homeless people living here? Sorry, I didn't tell you. But how did crime increase? Were there more robberies? Did you feel unsafe? Were there more people loitering? And everyone in the entire neighborhood said no, all of us. And they said that they would be willing to embrace them and have them come back. So I know that, there are people here from community groups and neighborhood groups that are very, very scared of this solution.
Not scared,
And
just.
or hesitant.
I'm not scared.
But I just want to say that, we have done this before, and I implore you to please look at it from another perspective. These people are just struggling. They're more likely to be victimized and victimize others. And we have successfully done this before. The one thing that did work with our little group is 9 out of 10 of our, people that we serve, the currently homeless downtown, living in tents in our shelter groups, they do say that they would prefer to live in a sanctuary campground than a shelter. And the nice thing about this solution is there was a veteran there that couldn't feasibly, I mean, he was about to kill someone at a shelter, primarily because he got so tired of being woken up, triggered, screaming, loud noises, he couldn't handle it. So having a tiny little space that's his with heat, that's their little sanctuary, worked out so great, but then they still had a community, where to meet over the fire, cook together, share resources, even though they had never met each other before. So I'm wondering if that could be a solution of spreading out, instead of having 100, one neighborhood house 100 people, if we could spread it out and find little properties, dilapidated property, nobody's living there. They kept, they did all the cutting up the grass and making sure that it looked nice, so it benefited the actual neighborhood. I wonder if that could be a solution of housing, small units of people in different areas. We have 3 micro houses that we can't do anything with right now because of these restrictions. And it's an emergency. We can do something. We can be brave.
When you mentioned the zoning restrictions, is it, what zoning restrictions do you see the?
Well, tell us.
Yeah, we had to move to Murray City.
So-
This property was put up for sale. Murray City came in and forced us to evict all of our people. We had 3 people living there at that point. One guy went out on the streets, violated parole, was interstate contacted, sent back to Kansas. How much money did that cost? And it's every single person that's on the road, on the street.
So it's
violates
probably-
laws. It's hard for, the police.
It's probably a couple of things, right? So it's probably some restrictions on the number of, like, how you live
Of course, yeah.
That's probably.
Of course. I know that we have prioritized single family zoning, and that's, more density, higher density zoning is really allowed. So I know that Edison and maybe Meter House are working on a solution for that. And maybe beyond what you.
We'll definitely.
Please, thank you.
Go ahead. You had a question.
Okay, sorry for digressing, I'm not most of other people, but, you mentioned that these HRCs were located in areas or proposed to be located in areas where resources were available. And she had asked, well, is there an option to instill these resources in areas where they're not available so that you can put these HRCs in areas? Does that make sense? So in addition to that, because I live in an area where I think a lot of these services become concentrated. Is there other efforts that are being made so that we're not localizing, like everyone else here is saying, localizing poverty and creating strains on resources and neighborhoods? Is there other things that are taken into consideration?
So that's one of the primary goals.
I'm all for the overlay, because I think it allows us to put it in areas where traditionally we're not at.
Can you explain that? That might be my biggest question. I came here expecting to see the overlay, and I'm really struggling with the idea that it's not a map that we can look at. So can you explain from a practical perspective, what does this do? Where does it open up? Because we're not planning committee people, you guys have special knowledge.
So basically, what an overlay of this type does is that it allows anyone who may want to open a homeless resource center to find a site anywhere in the city except Union Industrial Park. And they can work with that property owner to get permission to seek this. Then they would apply to the city to basically say, hey, I want to open this resource center on this property. I understand I have to basically apply this overlay to that property.
The overlay rules, right? So do we have the list of?
Yes, they are all in the code that we send out, and also summarized on the website, or summarized on the slide so that you can see those and try to figure out how you feel about those, and if there's some comments that you'd like to. There's a number of people who want to ask questions.
I just don't think, my point was, if if I was someone wanting to open up one of these, you know, for the greater good, it'd be easier for me to pass this if I'm near a hospital, fire station, police department, grocery store, you know, all that stuff. And so we're still encouraging these, after word development of, or HRC in these areas where currently they already are, based off of those resources already being there. So, like I said, I love this overlay, but what are we gonna do to encourage more of that development in areas on the east side?
Right.
There could be a transportation plan as part of the operations, right? To help get folks back and forth.
We're
I mean,
also considering impact of
I
overall.
just like to encourage them to.
I hear you.
To a particular fire district, right? And so if you're located within the same fire district, potentially another HRC, or maybe some of these service providers that maybe are also impacted by EMS calls, that's gonna be a factor.
See, you had a,
Both of my businesses are hardcore homeless control.
Can you speak up? Sorry.
Sorry, this is actually me only. That's fantastic. So I don't go a minute of my life without a lot of homeless impact and a lot of homeless interaction. As a resident and as a business owner, I'm wondering if there is a way to absolutely irrevocably tie any zoning to a transportation like requirement that is available after hours. I hire for the streets. My people can't get around, they can't rely on public transit in the middle of the night or if there's an emergency. There seems to be no public safety requirements in terms of lighting or finished streets or could be better. If we could tie some of the things you would expect in a residential, in a brick and mortar residential neighborhood, how many people have we lost because those safety features were not in place when dimensionals were referred? And those features were not in place, they were not fresh shelter. I would love to see that as like a permanent condition of having any resource centers.
so I want to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly, that you would like to see the requirements in the code for a homeless resource center or the city when if they were to decide to open a new one, wherever it may be, to either, those things either have to be in place or funded to be in place for that facility to open.
Yeah, I can't speak to the exact length of time, but I know there's a couple people in group who can. The men's shelter, it took almost no time at all before the first came around. And the first couple of traffic related deaths. And there was no reason for that, except that they plunked it in a place where there were no safety features.
Just the list of requirements that people have been talking about, did I understand you correctly that the city council could just override them?
No,
That was for a temporary.
That was for a temporary shelter. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
Thanks for clarifying.
ultimately, the city council decides all zoning rules, right? So at any point in time, they can start that process. When this gets to them, they can change anything in here that they feel.
But they would
Their
stick,
prerogative.
but they could stick as requirements, not guidelines.
Yes,
Okay.
if we're putting in our zoning code,
Okay.
it's a
Okay.
requirement. I mean, when they're considering where a future HRC may be located, they have a bunch of factors to consider. No one factor is necessarily, because the council, by their role, has that discretion, no one factor is necessarily gonna trump another one. That's gonna be up to them to decide how each of those factors weighs in, if that makes sense. So if one of the factors is the level of infrastructure related to public safety, whether it's sidewalks, curb gutter, street lighting, they can choose, they can decide, well, that is the most important factor for this particular location. We're gonna require those things. If it's something else, they can say that factor is the most important here. That's what we're gonna focus on. So they have a broad discretion in that.
The legislature considers.
But
State legislature considers.
they can't.
City has to follow the rules, but they can change the rules. But the state can ignore everything.
And the state can tell us what our rules should be. Or need to be, which they do.
This
Right.
is really quick, but, I'm almost sure that HB 440 is going to be changing this year.
Yeah,
They're very aware that some things didn't work the way they intended to, so I just, when we made some very specific rules to accommodate HB 440, I just wanna make sure you guys know that it's probably going to be changing.
And we will make sure that we are part of that. We are pretty in tune.
This process won't be complete until after the next session anyway, so.
Really cool, yeah, you're right.
Can I just circle around to the question, if you guys don't mind, because we have Andrew Johnston online to talk. Oh, you don't.
I just really quick, you've been raising your hand for a while.
I'm
so I
trying
want to
to
get to
be-
your question.
You know, thank you, staff, for such thoughtful work that you put into this, and I really appreciate the discussion, so. Michelle, talking about the road home, we do have a bunch of technical questions that we'll probably just submit to you in writing in the interest of time,
Great.
but a couple of things, that I want to just jump off of in the discussion, and that's the time factor. And the responsiveness of a city to be able to respond to the need is clearly very, very long with this process, if it's even going to be possible to get through all of these, which I question. I don't see a lot of the city taking the lead in helping to figure this out in this overlay plan.
When you say figure this out, what do you mean?
So let me expound on that. So we've just, we've come to understand that we as direct service providers, we see the need, we can come up and estimate what the future need might be, but it's not our role to decide where those facilities should be. And so the idea of, putting a finger down on a map somewhere and then coming and trying to go through this whole process is not going to happen. Like, that's not going, anywhere that's identified by us, the community will have issues with. So I would like to see the city being more of a leader in helping to decide where in the city places could be.
Yeah.
And also, to some of the comments, what else is the city going to bring to the table to commit to being partners around safety? So when we do have a facility that we are operating, like some really clear responsibilities for police and others to help and work with us and the neighbors in the area around. Because the way that I don't see it really addressed in here, that it's happening is that our very vulnerable guests and our staff are also in the same unsafe situations as the other property owners in that neighborhood. And it makes it so much harder for us to be able to help people. And I don't see that in here. I don't see the city taking a leadership role in those areas. And so with the submittal requirement, so that's my comment there, and please ask me questions on it, but with the submittal requirements, there's a lot of requirements, and I'm not clear who's responsible for doing all of those things. And I'm curious how Davis County is added in here, Salt Lake County, there's some things like that that I think we would love to have a lot more further discussion.
Okay, we're happy to have that. So on that last part, we can look at how the code divvies up, identifies who's responsible for what. There are some things that the city is responsible to provide. In that, obviously, only the city has access to the police and fire calls and what's going on and that kind of data. And the other data that is, I think that our elected officials have been pretty clear on is that they want to know how other communities along the Wasatch Front are headed and responding. That's been a huge accomplishment. And so they want to know that. Some of that information is gonna be readily available already, right?
Yeah.
And we may already have that, but if we don't have it, or if there's something new that we don't know about, we will ask somebody who's applying for this to do it. The second piece is the city can also identify locations for this process. It's not just up to a service provider to do. So if we are some point in the future and the elected officials decide we need an additional resource center, they can start this process. They can go out there and find property, they can decide whether city-owned land or other land is available, go through that, just like we did in 2016, 17. And then go through this process.
Sure, I just find that unlikely through this process.
What would you suggest would be a different one?
I don't know what the answer is. I just feel like it would be a lot more helpful to us to have something in here that said, if it's identified that more shelters needed and Salt Lake City is a place that should have more, then the city would work with providers to help identify where that should be.
We can look at adding something like that. We'll definitely take a look.
And really, just related to that, and I'll be quiet, the budget, like identifying all the funding sources ahead of time. We don't have all the funding sources identified every year for the existing programs. And so I just want to put that out there. Like it's pretty broad the way that it's written in here, but every year we're going to all of our partners, including private funders, to get funding to operate the existing program. So the idea that that would all have to be lined up ahead of time and laid out is probably unrealistic. And again, would be something that would just add months, if not years, to the process.
I mean, they could be.
That's just something for you to chew on.
Right.
It could be hypothesized.
So,
Can't guarantee.
so do you have a, I don't know the right terminology here, so I'm gonna try to explain it the best I can. But do you have like basically a fundraising plan about how you go about and do it?
Budget, yeah.
Yeah. Well, not just a budget, but if you need to, if you need to develop those resources, to increase your budget. I'm assuming
Yeah.
you have some
The development.
a development plan, thank you, to
Yeah, we
figure that
do,
out.
of course, have a development plan for the existing programs that we have.
Right, so if you were gonna expand, if you were looking to expand a program or expand a service, would you have something like that?
Yeah.
I think the confusion is that service providers aren't looking to expand their programs. The government identifies a need for, we have an issue with too many people living on the streets. So society, the community councils, everybody identifies that need, and then they ask service providers to provide that service. They should be committed to the funding, because it is the responsibility of the government to take care of its citizens.
Which I appreciate that, Wendy. I'm just saying, that all might not be, because this process is so long, that is in your requirements required before, like, one of the first things that's required. And I'm suggesting that that's something that actually doesn't happen until very close to opening the facility.
Okay. I mean, I don't know what the solution to that is. I mean,
Maybe just not having those requirements in the zoning.
I think
I'm
that's
just
gonna
saying,
be-
think about how you're saying identify funding sources to operate the facility.
So let me ask you this, how would the city know what the impact is to our ability to provide the other services without having an understanding of what resources someone's gonna bring?
And you
with them when
should,
they open?
just not at the very beginning of the process.
So it's a-
Like,
it's
that's
a
one of the
timing
things
thing.
that's,
So,
my reading, is required to be submitted right up front.
so that is something that could be addressed over time prior to perhaps in some kind of like a development agreement, like I was talking about, saying, all right, we're willing to do this once you have demonstrated these things.
Can I share more specific?
Is that?
Yes, that's exactly
I
what
want
I'm
to make sure I'm
saying.
understanding what.
And it's
potential
dynamic.
solution is.
So, right, when these HRCs opened, there was a thought that all the funding was gonna come from the state to
Yeah.
operate it, and
Yep,
then that didn't
absolutely,
happen.
right.
So I'm just saying, best thing. Okay, I'm done.
And then if you're going to private sources for funding, then what they want to see before they make a pledge is they want to see viabilities of the program and everything else that's in place before they make their pledge. So it's kind of a cart before the horse mentality. Completely understand the city wants to know before they do the project, are they going to be requested to pay for the ongoing costs to run that project in perpetuity, or is that going to be done by private funding? At the same time, private funding wants to look at the viability of the project before they make it. So it's a balance.
I think I understand what that issue is. We'll look at it, try to find a way to address that.
Thank you.
Hey, you know, a concern that I have is the timing for change. And I've sat through over it, you know, almost 2 decades of these meetings. And in 2000, process ended in 2017, I think, 2015, 16, 17, we were actively told by a previous county administration that their homeless diversion tactics would be so successful that when we removed an 1,100 bed facility, replacement with 700 beds, that the homeless diversions would be so successful that as the city and the county expanded in population, we would need less shelter beds in the future. That's nobody's responsibility in this room, but every service provider in the room is saying, no, no, no. We need to increase capacity in the entire homeless system, not just shelter beds, but affordable housing, inpatient recovery, mental health treatments. We have to increase our services at a greater, to stay at the same number of per capita of homeless per 10,000. We have to grow our services at the same rate as population growth. To get ahead of the system, we have to grow our entire homeless services at a rate faster than per capita growth. So in the 2017 process, we took a major step backwards when we took shelter beds offline. So a philosophical concern that I have is that the process is not so long and complicated that we get behind the ball. And because at that point in time, our entire community is suffering, because yes, it's valid that our our homeless friends can have a negative impact on the greater community, but there's a greater concern is if there's no homeless service providers there, then it's going to be an exponentially large negative impact on the entire community, because it's going to be more camping, more public nuisance, more crime, more everything, because we don't have enough service providers to be the immediate need, and then not only the immediate emergency need, but the avenue of change, so they're not dependent upon subsidies in perpetuity. So the timing of long-term strategy is, I think, an important issue to consider. And every year, we're going to have to be adapting to cold weather, every year.
Just mention the caveat that our community economy has a lot to do with its population growth. In just 1 year, 2 of them calls for housing have doubled.
That's valid.
Very specific question. So our ALS services and our BLS services here in the city are supplied by 2 different entities. One is Gulf Cross, and they are a private entity, where and that would be our basic BLS services. Where our advanced, more critical care is our fire department and our paramedics. So I was just wondering, when we did look at safety issues, specifically, and more wraparound issues, did we talk to Gold Cross, who provides almost all of our ALS services? Or did we just talk to the fire department?
I think we just talked about fire.
So, that is kind of, specifically, I don't think we should, they do it for the entire city. We probably shouldn't leave them out of this very important discourse. They are a private company, of course, but most like man down calls are entirely handled by Gold Cross, not the fire.
The fire department keeps the record of when it's.
Wait, I didn't hear the first part.
The fire department keeps a record when it's advanced life services.
Yeah, the ALS, not the BLS.
Yes.
So if the basic, which requires, doesn't require a paramedic, is entirely Gold Cross. So I think that just kind of echoing what people are talking about, potentially that is a gap
Yeah,
that I brought up.
we'll try to touch base with more detail from the fire department, how they respond. I know that they are changing some of their response because of some different funding that they receive.
I would also
some
talk to
of that
Gold Cross.
Kind of stuff, but also to Gold Cross.
Yeah, I would
And
get,
see, we'll reach out to them and see how much they're willing to talk to us about that kind of stuff and how it impacts them.
What
There's a
I
hand
was
back there.
saying is that the fire department keeps records
of the BLS stuff.
and the ALS. So when we engaged with the fire department, they had a breakdown of both. They understood which, like how their calls would be distributed.
Which even though it's 7% of all the calls going to the two HRCs, there are some plans to, that's where I was referring to Andrew to answer your previous question. He's online, if you want to talk about that pilot real quick.
Do you want me to?
Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You're talking about the pilot for medical staff in the resource centers?
Yes.
Yeah, Fourth Street Medical Clinic has been working on funding EMTs, I believe, in the 3 resource centers, I believe. And that's daytime. They've asked us to partner them on evening coverage overnight. And so we are proposing, we will be proposing to the city council some funding to do that on a first-year basis and analyze the impact positively or negatively.
Thank you.
Andrew, is that for mental health calls as well?
Well, it would be medical staff on site, so they could triage anything that they felt they could, but I wouldn't say it would avoid calling 911 or dispatch for various needs. So we're going to see what the positive impact as far as how many of those situations could be handled without calling emergency services versus those that it'll still be triage and maybe still call and see what the impact is.
For any other questions?
I've had a lot. In the conditional use process, which I understand a little bit more, the planning commission and the city council, they made decisions based on objective elements. It's basically, if you meet these conditions, they approve. If you don't, they do not. In the overlay process, will it be objective or will it be subjective by the city council?
It probably is more subjective. And that's because the impacts that they can consider are different. One of the weaknesses with the conditional use process is that we can't necessarily deal with some of the budget needs the city may have associated with the future homeless resources. Right, that is completely outside of the planning commission's role. They don't, they can consider the impact of any service the city provides. And then they can decide how that will be mitigated. One of the problems is that we know that there's going to be an increase in some city service as a result of that. That alone would give the planning, and there's no way that someone other than the city can mitigate that. That alone could lead to a denial, right? And that's something that we don't think is fair. Excuse me, we don't think that's fair. We don't think that's the right way for this kind of thing to be decided. It's something that really does need to be decided by the entity that has the ability to fill those gaps and address those needs and impact city services.
So the subjectivity of it can really go in both directions.
It can.
It can be subjective. You didn't meet this requirement, but we really need you, so we're gonna do it anyways, or it can be the opposite, is you meet all the requirements. But we just really don't want this in this area, so they deny it. And the council, if approved, is looking to maintain that subjective versus objective ability.
Yeah, I think so.
And the city council would know that's putting them politically in a very difficult situation.
Well, they're the elected people that are in a political challenging situation.
Yeah, it's pay for us. Very politically difficult.
I think, you know, I think one of the things that went into our decision-making was that actual very thing. And the benefit of having an elected official be that person is that they're subject to elections. And so if it is politically challenging, then the community has a way to respond to that. Whereas if it's staff level, planning commission, there's not the same kind of ability for the community to influence that, right? And so I think there are some decisions that they're hard, they're challenging. And that's why we do have elected.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my question is really hopefully short and maybe technical. So does the overlay affect the zoning requirements of the underlying zone?
Those are still
It's like it doesn't affect it at all. So if you're in an R17,000 zone, like those are the rules that you're.
You would still have to abide by whatever those rules are. It's just the use becomes authorized.
Okay, great.
But know that the city can change the zoning,
Which exists.
which is exactly what happened the last time.
But which exists now, right? And that's gonna be something that exists in perpetuity. City councils are always going to have that ability to establish the rules.
Same process. So it wouldn't just zoning change. And we are at time, I think.
But we got one more question over here.
Yeah, I have a question about your community engagement process, because I know that's come up, and it's been like one of the reasons for doing the overlay zone over the conditional use permit. But I wanna understand how the city wants to acknowledge how the clients are oftentimes in our community engagement process. I know, because I've worked with community engagement with Salt Lake City, and I know that they make a good effort to try and make that a more equitable process, but we just have to recognize that, like, even reformatting typical public engagement methods is just not accessible to people who are clients. And there's another thing too that I see a lot, and I've seen it with Salt Mill Creek Shelter, when I was there and listening to that, is whether it's implicitly or explicitly stated, there's often a very much an us versus them narrative. So for example, safety concerns, that's not us versus them. And when we do that, we run the risk of alienating clients who are utilizing these services from the communities around them. I know that there are people who can cause disruptions and negative impacts, but when we put every client and start either again, explicitly or implicitly putting them in that bag, we alienate them from the process. We run over what could be common ground and common interest between the community and clients. And I think that the city, through engagement, has the potential to be an entity or facilitator that could like try to shift that narrative away and move it towards like what are the common grounds between the clients here and the community here? How can we work together? Or at the very least, like recognize that clients can't access public engagement and know that and we have some kind of fail-safe or some kind of part of the process that acknowledges that, recognizes it, so that those underrepresented voices aren't being overruled every time.
Yeah, we can certainly look into having a requirement of engagement includes that. We actually did do that as part of this. We went out and talked to people who utilize the homeless related services. So definitely, I think that's a great point, and we can look at having that be a required engagement activity.
I do want to say thank you guys and Allison, for coming to us, and 700 online surveys about this. I do appreciate that.
Thank you.
Engagement.
Weston, I think I saw your hand go up, you were.
No, I was pointing out the hand was up.
Oh,
It's
okay.
helping on your back.
So I think that.
Kathy's face is on the screen, I don't know.
Thank you. I'll say hello. Thank you for tonight. And Nick, I'll be in touch. I have the same kind of concerns about how long it would take to get approval. I think there should only be one public hearing, for example. And anyway, timelines are really tricky with finding a place and getting the funding and all of that. So maybe we could talk through some potential examples that could help us think it through a little more.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. And I think that we also are interested in hearing ways that we can somehow, at least for some of the processes, have a set time frame, right? I think we would support of trying to figure that out and what that means so that it's not 7 months before someone gets to planning commission, right? Like, let's try to figure something out along those lines.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right. With that, I just want to thank everybody for participating, helping, and being, having frank conversations about this, because it's the only way that we're going to come out with a process that is better than what we've had. So thanks again, and we'll continue to have additional, like I said, there's the additional opportunities. If anybody wants to submit written comments on that code, our information is I think it was in the invite that everybody received. It's also online. Send them our way. We will respond to every comment that we get. We may not be able to address all those comments, but those that are related to something else, we'll make sure those people who can get that. And we'll try to be as responsive as we can to everybody's input.
Sounds good.
Thank
you. I'm gonna give you my card.
Very nice to meet you. I'm Esther.
Hi, Esther. You have some